is 26, 28, a list of things there, but it's easy to understand, and it is the foundation of everything we're going to talk about when we get to. We're going to spend 3 or 4 weeks just on the Constitution itself, the structure and characteristics of it, the spirit of it, the Bill of Rights, and our federalist system that came from it. But again, during this time, Thomas Jefferson, of course, writes up the Declaration. Before that, Thomas Paine had published his booklet, Common Sense. The printing press was relatively new in the world, 200 years old by that time, maybe 300. But people were reading. Americans were very well read, and Thomas, and this was, we're not all just good people or bad people, and our lives aren't just either full of glory or full of nothingness. Thomas Paine, this was his moment of glory. He lived out his life in relative infamy after this. He went over to England and so on, but this was his moment. He was inspired, and he wrote about the common sense of declaring independence from Great Britain, and said things like the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. These are the times that try men's souls, and the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot, in tough times they go away. But he said those people that in tough times stand by principles, they deserve the thanks of men and women. And he said, I should have memorized this so we could, but you've heard him. He said, is life so precious?
Here it is.
You got it? There we go. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It's dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if such a celestial article as freedom should not be highly rated and highly priced, which means our lives, And it was inspiring to Americans. It got a lot of people over the hump. But it's still, here we are, July 2nd, and they're still not sure what they're going to do. So you've got the report of the and let's read the Declaration. Well,
here are the 5 guys. It was Thomas Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston.
Well, that's a pretty good group. I'm not real familiar with Livingston. He was around there, but John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Who's?
Well, this Roger Sherman had no formal education, but he signed all 5 of our founding documents.
And Roger Sherman saved the Constitutional Convention a couple of days. His Connecticut Compromise ended up being the great compromise that we'll talk about. That was the main thing that saved the convention from just falling apart. Yeah, Roger Sherman's one of my favorite guys. I want to, I guess, make reading the Declaration the last thing. But so let's talk about here. They all knew that they were going to be subject to want-out posters, and that there would be a war, and the king's soldiers would focus on them and their families and their mansions if they had them, their lands and so on. The king would do all they could to pay them, make them pay the price, destroy them, and put them to death, and some of their families and so on. And so they weren't sure, even once the Declaration was written up. I guess I want to say one more thing about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington was, in my book, a demigod. He was right up there, with. But Thomas Jefferson was a great guy too, and you've probably heard the story of when President Kennedy back. There was a White House gathering there of supposedly the greatest minds. I think there were scientists, greatest minds, in the world at the time. And he said, this is possibly the greatest gathering of intelligence here under the White House roof since Thomas Jefferson dined here alone. His tribute to Thomas Jefferson, who was brilliant and eloquent and was inspiring. In fact, he was smart enough and he was humble enough that, as Bob, we were talking about this before, he said, Thomas Jefferson didn't write the Declaration of Independence. Well, he did write it, and he put it together. But he didn't just use his own words. He stood on the shoulders of giants, and he used the words of Lighthorse Henry Lee and Patrick Henry and Locke and Cicero and so on. And so we'll identify those.
I think history said there's 135 revisions, so he is very original, but they did revise it a little bit.
Here you go. Say that again, 135 revisions.
Yeah, what, you know, a little comma here, a word there, or something like that, but the major idea was there, but, yeah, there was some revisions to it as they went through the process.
My understanding is the original version
Or
abolished
tweaking,
slavery.
yeah, tweaking.
Yeah, but he realized, well, okay. We could just kill every cat in the island to address all these issues, but with the Constitution, we're going to address a lot of those issues like slavery that did not get resolved. We started off with all men are created equal, but we didn't abolish slavery with the with the Declaration or with, and I will say this before we read it. The Declaration of Independence not only is the U.S. Constitution the law of the land and the supreme law of the land, but the Declaration of Independence was the very first law that was passed by Congress, by this new Congress, when they created this country. And that day, and this is law. The Declaration of Independence is law, and these principles are the principles not only that the Constitution is based on, but they're the principles that America is, and it's what makes us different from all the others. You've heard a bunch of times here, God is the sovereign, and He made us sovereigns when He gave us unalienable rights. You're going to hear God-given unalienable rights is the basis of law and politics here in America. You're going to hear that over and over and over again. So let's read what Thomas Jefferson said. Again, there are 6. If you just follow along with me, I will appreciate your humoring me. Attentiveness, yeah. We got 6 paragraphs. The first paragraph, maybe I better put on my glasses, get this right.
You want to volunteer or something?
No, I'm fine. I got a bunch of things I want to say before we do it. When in the course of human events, he said, I'm going to paraphrase it first. He says, if we're going to declare independence from a country, it makes sense, just out of respect for other nations, that we give the reasons for why we're going to do that. So he says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, to Great Britain, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Laws of nature and of nature's God, that's Cicero, natural law, laws of nature and you and I, the average American listens to those and think, I've heard that before, I wonder what he meant and so on. But the Founding Fathers were very clear on this. Cicero was one of their, he wasn't one of the most recent philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, and Humes, and so on, but he was 1800 years before. He was about 50 years, he was a
Roman statesman.
Yeah, he was he was a Roman consul, which is higher than a Roman senator. He's just second to Caesar himself, and so he was high up a philosopher and a politician and a powerful man there. But he articulated this, and if you read that principle, if you read that part in the 5,000-year leaf about him, you'll understand it better. He says, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them, force them to this separation. So then he says probably the most important, or the most famous part, and is not just the basis of the Declaration, but it's, again, the basis of everything in America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Same thing as inalienable. They can't be alienated. They can't be taken away from us because God gave them to us, not the state, not the government. And that means the state and the government can't take them away from us. Every other country in the world says the government can take the government can take away. But in America, we don't believe that. Endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and lists 3 of them there: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Later on in the body of the Constitution, we get 3 more: habeas corpus, no ex post facto law, no bills of attainder. And then in the Bill of Rights, we get 25 more of them, all of which in America we believe are unalienable rights, that we have these by birth. The government didn't give us the right to keep and bear arms, or freedom of speech, religion, press, the right to all of our criminal due process rights, but they were born with those. By our humanity, we have those rights. But he mentions 3 of them here: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, this is the reason governments are created. To secure these rights, governments are instituted. So if we institute governments to secure our rights, if the government does not secure our rights, but abuses our rights and usurps our rights, then he's going to say we have the right to get rid of that government. So get ahead of ourselves. To secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Why does the government have to have the consent of the governed? Because who are we? We're the sovereigns. We're the sovereigns. We are the political gods here, under God. And if we're smart, by the way, some of the founding fathers said, if we're really, really, really smart, we won't just get a big head about being the sovereigns, but we'll figure out what are God's true and correct principles, and we will implement them in our secular society. Right? Deriving their powers from the consent of the government. But, he says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends or purposes to protect the rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government. It's our right and responsibility to fire the government. That's what we did in 1776. And if they don't straighten themselves out, then we may have to do it again here. That's our right and responsibility. Us and everybody else on the earth, and it's always been that way. It's just that somehow they figured it out to the extent that made it work then. I'm going to kind of skip through some of this now. We don't need to go through all of it. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And all experience has shown that mankind are disposed to suffer. We've put up with a lot here in America. And we're not just throwing off our government for light and transient reasons, but when it gets really bad, he says, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, which he's going to list, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces or shows a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, the people's, it's their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for the security, new government, right? That such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former system of government. The history of the present King of England is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states, the 13 colonies. To prove this, let's list these things. And so he lists, you said 26, I counted maybe 28, but maybe they're just 26 paragraphs, and some of them have more than one in them.
Yeah.
So at this time, were most of the inhabitants from Great Britain?
Yes, all of them considered. I mean, there were a lot of them who were born here in America.
No. But of or origin of Great Britain,
Yes.
descent, and
Yes.
all the 13 colonies.
Yeah.
There
Yes.
wasn't any French or.
Oh, there were some.
German?
There were a few French, and there were a few from other
Great
countries
Britain,
around the
Germany.
world, and so on. Yeah, people were coming from, but most of them were
In
English.
1776.
And virtually all of them in 1776 considered themselves British subjects, and most of them loyal, although a lot of them were not loyal by 1776, but they were loyal in 1763 before they started the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and all these things. Yeah, they were mostly from England, descended from
Great
England.
Britain, Ireland.
Although people were starting to come to America for political, economic, and religious freedom, all three reasons. So this listing, we won't go through all of them, but just to say what some of them are, and you can look through, a lot of these end up, he says, he's taxing us, he sends these bureaucrats here to eat out our substance, he's quarters soldiers in our houses, he lists a lot of things that were going on here. It's a list of the abuses that were going on. And most of these things get addressed one way or the other in the U.S. Constitution. They're the things that they had been living with day after day, week after week, in the leading up to these times. Several of the things here, for example, he says the king, he won't recognize laws that are passed by our individual colonial legislatures. He will move the place that we have the legislature is called, he'll move it to another town, and then he'll only tell the people that are on his side. And he says here, he tries to wear us out with having to, ride 50, 100 miles to some other place and get there in time because we just found out about it at the last minute and so on. Same thing with judges. He says many judges, he'll only let judges who will go along with the kind of laws that he wants, and he makes them reliant on him for their pay and for their judgeships in the first place and in the last place.
Sort of like Joe Baker, only letting certain people
Right.
complete their car.
He's made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices, the amount of payment of their salaries. He's erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. It's worse than that today, probably. He's come among us in times of peace, standing armies here in the, we don't believe in a standing army here. He's affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. What does that mean? Well, those guys back then understood it. George Washington understood it. In the Revolutionary War, when there was no money coming from Congress because they didn't have money to tax under the Articles of Confederation, and so they didn't have shoes, for Pete's sake, as well as uniforms and guns and bullets. They had to Congress had to ask states to voluntarily, and Maryland donated some, and Virginia donated some here and there and so on, but George Washington had to get Solomon Heim and some others that would raise money for him. Yes?
Yeah, John Adams, though, was overseas at the time trying to get loans from the Dutch to finance their war. It was amazing.
Yeah, in fact, John Adams at that time, no, it was after that. He was the
Tried to patch things
Constitutional
up.
Convention time. Let's just march on Philadelphia. We didn't have Washington, D.C. said, let's march on Philadelphia and make them give us some money. And we're out here dying and getting maimed and bleeding and so on. Let's make Congress pay for this. We'll show them. You know, we got the military power. And George Washington said, you don't get it. That's not what we believe in America. We believe that the government, that the military has to be subservient to the civil power, to the representatives of the people, that it's the people who control things. And even if we're not doing it very well right now, he said, I'm not going to be the one who's going to lead a military revolution. And of course, once the revolution ended up being won by divine providence, everybody wanted him to be a king. And he said, you still don't get it. We just fought to get rid of a king. We don't want a king. We want to have the people somehow in charge of our government. We'll get to that.
Israelites.
Yeah, they wanted a king. Okay.
Can I interject one?
Please,
line
Rudy.
there? Among these, and I'm a minority opinion when it comes to our border security, but I just want to point out that one of the things they complained about the king, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. So in other words, he was making it hard for people to come here, hard for them to get established here legally, hard for them to own land, which is exactly what Mr. Trumpster is talking about.
So that he could have complete control. I mean, that's what he really wanted, was
So is
complete
Cruz.
control.
So is Cruz.
Unfortunately, so is almost anybody but a open border libertarian. I mean, I don't know of any
Rudy's a libertarian.
that are on open borders.
I'm a
I
libertarian
mean, you
with a
used to
small
want
L.
to be one.
No, I've always been a libertarian with a small L, but he's got a capital L. All right. Imposing taxes on us without our consent, cutting off trade with all parts of the world, depriving us of the benefits of trial by jury. Trial by jury was at least 1,000 years old in England. You know, the common law that we'll learn about came from England. We're talking about them as our enemies here, but they were our heritage. And a lot of this wonderful stuff that we got, common law, had been developed over 1,000 years or more in England. And the jury was probably the most sacred thing, because the jury was based on the same thing as by the crown. But if it's a criminal right and they may take away your life, liberty, or property, you have the right to be tried by a jury.
Most juries aren't told today is that they have the right to judge the law too.
Fully informed jurors. But we're not going to get into that tonight, because that would be but you're right about that. I mean, it's all important. Okay, let's go down now to the fourth, fifth, and sixth paragraphs. In the fourth paragraph, he says, in all of these oppressions, we've petitioned for redress of our grief in the most humble terms, and the king has just ignored us. And so he says, a prince, a king, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Well, we can say that about any country in the world today. I don't care who they are. It doesn't matter who they are. If they're unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Okay, so then we've tried to talk to them also. We've appealed to Parliament to extend unwarrantable, unjustifiable jurisdiction over us. Here, we've appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. he uses words like magnanimity, magnanimity, their bigness of heart. We've appealed to that, and we've disavowed these usurpations. You know, to support us and say to the king and the parliament, that's not right to treat them that way over there in America. He says, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too, our British brethren, they too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So now they got to draw the conclusion and declare independence. We therefore, and this is not his language again, all of these phrases he's using from other great people, 2,000-year-old philosophers, and just a month before that, Patrick Henry.
What is consanguinity? Whatever.
Consanguinity has to do with our
Google.
our brotherhood and our family connections and goodness of, you know, love of family and so on. You know, at least that's what. Does anyone else have a definition of consanguinity?
No.
Without Google.
Sure.
Here it is.
That's what Google.
Same blood. Same
Blood relation is the property of being from the same kinship as another person. In that aspect, consanguinity is the quality of being descended from the same. So you're saying, look, we're all British, you know, we're family, and you ought to care about us, that we're being mistreated over here, but they ignored him. So he said, we therefore, the representatives of the United States in General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies. Why is it the authority of the good people?
Because they're sovereigns.
Because they're the sovereigns. I mean, by the time we get out of here, you're going to be radicals. Say, we're the sovereigns because we ought to be. Authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Who just said that a month before? Richard Henry Lee. That they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, do all the other acts and things which independent states and countries may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors. And many of them lost their lives. At least half of them lost their fortunes. None of them lost their sacred honor. So we declared independence. Well, that didn't solve the problem yet, but it did make us free. And there was already soldiers here, and there are thousands more then that are being sent over. And we start the Revolutionary War, which we won't spend a whole lot of time on. I mean, it's fascinating, but all we can say is that God had to help out, or they'd have never won. George Washington is the commander-in-chief.
McCullough's 1776 really covers that. It is amazing.
Which what?
McCullough's book,
1776, who wrote John Adams more recently.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he wrote about just that period of time when they were fighting that war.
You know, if we're recommending books, I recommend one called, it's a series, there are 8 volumes, it's a Prelude to Glory, but it's historical fiction, and it takes one particular family and kind of goes through over the years, and of course, somebody in the family is always there at every major point along the Revolution. So anyway, it's fascinating, but so we have, that's what we wanted to get through today, is the Declaration of Independence. I will say this, there's a apocryphal story, it's not proven, but story of it's told and has been published a number of times, that during the in Constitutional Hall there, where they signed the Declaration of Independence, when they were debating that day for hours, from morning till evening, whether or not to sign the Declaration of Independence and put their heads on the chopping blocks, and they're going back and they're talking about the gibbet and so on, and finally some old man from the back stands up and gives this great speech, which I've had in front of me. I would do, but
What is it?
it's a long speech that he gives, but it's inspiring to everyone. And at the end of it, they're all worked up and so on. And he says, sign, and that they as a body rush forward and start signing the Declaration. And then when it's over, the doors were locked, as it was in the Constitutional Convention later. And when it's all done, you know, they look to thank this guy, and of course he's not there. And I know who he was, but it's an apocryphal story. It's not something that is necessarily true. Somebody reported it, you know, years later, and then it's been reported in a number of different things. But as far as I can tell, it's, you know, it's not proven. But they did have to somehow get over that hump to declare independence and take the chance with a very real thing. Now, if you go and you read McCullough's 1776 or the Prelude to Glory or any of the others, you will see that the king had his soldiers seeking out their places to burn down, to destroy their mansions. It's Speech of the Unknown. There you go. There you go. It's worth reading. You know, it's inspiring. Good literature doesn't have to be true, by the way. I mean, there's some pretty inspiring fiction, and we don't have time to read it. But if you want to go home, you know, look up Google the Speech of the Unknown, and it is inspiring. And he said that the principles that he said were true, and our founding fathers in that convention, at least, were inspired by those things. And some people would have said rashly, you know, did this thing, but thank heaven they did. Yes.
The dates of all our acts and stuff like that date from the Declaration of Independence, not from the Constitution. That's another thing. When they got the rights and laws, they would date it.
Yeah, in fact, when they wrote down the supreme law of the land, they said at the very end, they used the going back 2,000 years, but they also said in the year of our freedom, the 12th.
Yeah.
Why they didn't say the 11th?
Yeah.
But they did say the 12th.
Yeah.
They did say the 12th.
Because they counted 1776 as number one.
They counted 1776 as the first year,
Right.
and they
So that's
dated
the
a lot of
12th
things
year.
from 1776. That's right. That's right. That's where that 12th year came from.
That's where.
It's in the 12th year. It wasn't by the end of the 12th year, but they were into the 12th year. Like, yeah. I'm 66 now. I'm in my 67th year. Well, that's where they figured it. Okay, we've declared our independence.
That's very.
We may say a little bit more about the Revolutionary War, but next time we're going to delve into the what's that?
Peace. He wishes you peace. He wishes you love.
Now, for the next few weeks, we're gonna get into the U.S. Constitution. I'm going to take a brief time about the Articles of Confederation, which was a useless, no good national government, and good riddance that we got rid of it.
How do you really
But it
feel
was an
about
attempt, and there was a reason why they did it. Pardon me?
How do you really feel about it?
I'm going to tell you next week. I'm serious about it. And then we'll get into the Constitution. We'll talk about how the Constitution was created. We'll watch a video. It's a real good. There's a lot of ones. We'll watch one called A More Perfect Union, and it's good. You'll get the spirit of how things and the deliberations and how the Constitutional Convention. It's just a miracle that they. And one of the conclusions that you will draw by the end is that there was not a single one of them, and there were some great men there. George Washington. Wait a minute. I got 1 minute. I got it. George Washington, George Mason, George Wythe, a lot of Georges, Edmund Randolph, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, pardon? James Madison, the father of the Constitution. But not a single one of them had it all put together in his own mind. In fact, the great ones, Washington, Madison, Franklin, they were wrong on what ends up being Roger Sherman's great compromise and so on. It is a miracle what happened. So we'll talk about the miracle in Philadelphia, and we'll get into the structure of the Constitution and the substance of the Constitution and more of the spirit of the Constitution. Of course, the 1787 is when they put together the Constitution, the main body of the Constitution, and then they sent it out for ratification. And as you'll learn, am I out of time?
10 seconds.
You used them up now.
As you will learn,